Sending data. Well, we are online. But let me check. Gregor, can you check? Can you check if it is okay?
Luis, you should mute your own double microphone.
For me, it doesn't work yet. It still shows that page when you start it up. Just reload that. Not yet. It's changed. It's a different page now than it was for a while. But and on Facebook, I don't think it will see there. Not yet.
Well, if the worst comes to the worst, we can ask everybody to connect to Zoom and see where it crashes.
But I
But
think
if we do that, we can insist that all people mute their microphones and that only the so-called active participants can interrupt in real time. So if everybody behaves, then that's all right.
But I'm not sure how you get that link now out to everyone so quickly.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good question.
We could record it and then post it afterwards, even though we lose that live interaction.
Well, yes, but that's
not as
Maybe Luis will manage. It's maybe just he's working on it. Let's give it a run. We had 110 people.
let's see.
Let's give it a little extra time. On Facebook, it has. I think it has restarted on Facebook. Yeah. Okay. And YouTube is not yet back. We have more viewers on YouTube usually.
Yeah, usually we have.
here on YouTube. It hasn't restarted yet. It says live now, but that's a joke. Nope.
08.
I've had experience with Zoom with lots of people. It's basically a license, so it's not a problem technically speaking. It's a question now how to manage it.
Yeah, I'm not the expert in managing everything on Zoom, but if everybody manages themselves, then
I think that I think that YouTube is now. I can see YouTube.
You can see?
Yes.
I'll restart it.
I think that YouTube is now. I can see YouTube.
Just restart it.
Yes.
I'll restart it.
yes, now I can see it on YouTube.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
All right, we go.
Okay, so
Good to go.
we seem to be back in business, so let's mute ourselves and Marco, I think.
Good to go.
Okay, thank you. So as I was saying, thank you. So as Mario mentioned earlier, I've been working on with the hand system for a number of years, and as I said earlier, I will describe why I decided to work on the hand system. But before I move to the science stuff, I just want to show you why I did Arizona. So Mark said like a stack, I will put it in.
A little nicely, more nicely than that, because in fact, I love being here. It's a great place, as you can see, pretty scenic, beautiful, Grand Canyon, all the good stuff. And as you guys were complaining about the polar vortex, I have to say we have 100+ degrees here, so if you want to grow your tomatoes, I could help you out here. And then on the right, you see the campus, which is also very beautiful. Mark has visited and others have visited, so it's a very good place to be in. And this is what I've done all my academic career after my postdoc. So let me tell you a little more about what this talk is going to be about. I'm going to give you a very broad overview. Couldn't cover everything, of course. Couldn't cover the work of everybody who works in the hand, given that it's a very large number of people, very good work, etc. But I'm going to be focusing on, an overview. Since this is a summer school, I wanted to give you some foundation about the fundamentals of neuromechanical properties of the hand, and then move into some more data-driven kind of a presentation regarding what we know, different approaches to study sensory motor learning, grasping and manipulation, the mechanisms, etc. And then I'd like to spend a little bit of time at the end just to tell you about some open questions and some kind of project we've been working on, which some of it is published, some of it is work in progress. So regarding the first part, I usually start by giving this overview of, from a developmental perspective, whereby everybody is very excited when a child or an infant makes the first step, and that's definitely a milestone in development. But we also know, at least people that care about the hand, that there are other, maybe less visible, so to speak, or less exciting, maybe, milestones, and one of them is the ability to actually grasp. And so in the first couple of months of life, you see a number of reflexes that fade away with development, but there is one in particular which is really interesting, which is this grasp reflex, whereby all fingers close as a unit, as a synergy, if I can use the pun here, if you stroke the hand of the infant. And then as you look a little later in life, you see, the ability to reach and grasp. Here I'm showing all this video of Sophia here that is pretty content chewing from an apple, and then at some point realizes, I could do this myself, and boom, you reach, grasp, and bring the food to your mouth. And this development around 5 months is also very interesting. Coordinate proximal and distal muscle of your upper limb, not a trivial feat. And then as you go and wait, so also an overview of that. But this is pretty much the ability to oppose the thumb to the index fingertip in this particular case, which again, it's a pretty complicated task, biomechanically speaking, because you need to make sure that these forces balance each other, you don't crash the object, etc. And as you can see, it takes quite a while for this particular ability to develop. And so the thing I usually emphasize is that, in fact, the hand is both a motor and sensory instrument, if you want to call it that way, because in fact it has this very interesting and rich interplay between what we perceive through our hands and the information that we gather is then transformed into planning and action, which then allows us to do all the things that we can do with our hands. And I usually follow with this statement that, as we all know, in this summer school, and of course the students who are listening, having a very complex system, and by complex I mean endowed with a lot of elements like the hand, is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because, of course, it allows us to do a lot of things. So we can create tools, we can use tools, we can express ourselves, we can manipulate the object, etc. And yet, when something goes wrong in the neuromuscular system, then it's really, really challenging to recover some of that function. So I'm giving you 3 examples here at the bottom, very different problems, but nevertheless significant problems. One is stroke, whereby now you lose the ability, among other things, of individuating your fingers, that is, moving the fingers independently. Here you see another example whereby now, if you lose a hand through a translational amputation, like shown here, now you need to design a system that most closely resembles the intact hand function, which again is incredibly challenging if you think about the sensory input that you need to provide to the system, if you think about the coordination of forces of the fingertips, etc. It's really, really challenging. And even in this area too has received a significant amount of attention. And then here on the bottom right, it's another example. It's a very famous example of the work by Andy Schwartz and his team at the University of Pittsburgh, where an individual who is paralyzed from the neck down is able to control a robotic hand, a robotic arm, to reach and grasp objects using online signals that are being captured and decoded from the cortex, from the cerebral cortex. And so clearly very different problems here, but it gives you a sense of the complexity of the system in when it's physiologically working, but also again the challenges that we have to face when we're trying to reconstruct or recover some of those particular capabilities. So because of this, and because the hand is central to a lot of activities that we do, and also because of the neuromuscular features that it has, I've been particularly intrigued about it, and this is why I've been working on, with the system for over 20 years now. And what particularly intrigues me is the interface between the neural machinery, so to speak, and the mechanical machinery. And I will tell you a little bit about this. But clearly I'm going to tell you a little bit about the representations of hand movements, not as much about the sensory domain because it would be a little too much given the duration of the talk. I'm going to tell you a little more though about the mechanical characteristics. And then the question is really how these 2 domains interface. And so here, just to convince you why the hand is such a great system to work with, I mentioned some of the classic problems that we're all familiar with in motor control, classic problems, which the hand can be used to address those questions. In particular, how do you control multiple degrees of freedom? Or how do you integrate sensory feedback with motor commands and the neural representation of skill behavior? So all of this can be captured and can be addressed using the hand. So starting from the peripheral anatomy, the numbers are pretty staggering when you start to look at the number of bones, when you start to look at the number of muscles, when you look at the fact that these muscles have very, very different mechanical characteristics. But nevertheless, they need to be working in a very well-coordinated fashion, both spatially and temporally. So I picked 3 of several, let's call them, for lack of a better word, problems that the nervous system need to face or need to address when controlling the hand. One has been addressed by a number of individuals, a number of labs, including Mark and others, Tatyorsk, etc. And this is the fact that you have these very long tendons coming out of this extrinsic muscles, flexors and extensors of the fingers, but you also have some passive structures, some passive tissue that connects these tendons that then insert on the fingers. Now, this is not a control problem per se until you want to move just one finger at a time. And when you try to do that, assuming that you can control in an isolated fashion just the compartment of the finger you want to move, which you can't really, but let's assume you could, every time you're going to move, say, this finger, the passive connection across the tendons will passively drag and move a finger that you didn't intend to move. So what that means is that every time you want to move a finger and you want to block movement of the others, you need to co-contract a number of muscles in the hand, which is very contrary to your intuition, whereby thinking of moving a finger would just involve the muscles of the finger. And it's totally not the case. The second problem is the fact that you have tendons that are very long, of course, but they span multiple joints, wrist, metacarpal, proximal, and distal interphalangeal joints. So again, it's very convenient from the perspective of generating a torque on multiple joints simultaneously. Now that's very convenient only if you want that. If you want to block the action of a joint or two joints, for whatever reason, for a particular task, now you need to worry about preventing the unwanted torques of those joints. And so again, it's definitely not a one muscle controlling one finger. It's a series of muscles that need to be coordinated with each other. So that's the second kind of problem. And then one last problem I wanted to bring up, and this is the fact that you have extrinsic and intrinsic muscles. Extrinsic muscles, as shown earlier, are long muscles that pretty much cover the entire forearm, and then with these long tendons that reach the fingertips, or either the fingertip here distally or proximally here. The question that comes up is that, in terms of control, is that you also have intrinsic muscles, which these are muscles that do not cross the wrist. So these are muscles whose origin and insertion are within the hand. Now, but these muscles are very important, and they're synergists of extrinsic muscles. What that means is that if you want to move a finger again, both sets of muscles, those that cross the wrist and those who don't, need to be coordinated. It's an interesting problem because, as you know, from muscle physiology and muscle mechanics, this is a classic length tension curve, which shows that your ability to exert force is a function of the length of the muscle. It peaks at intermediate length because of the optimal overlap of actin and myosin here. But as you get at very short length or very long length, as this overlap, it's either too much and they cannot slide any further, or if there's zero overlap here, then the muscles cannot exert any force. So if you translate this into what happens to the extrinsic muscles, which will change their length as the wrist moves, but you have another set of muscle whose length doesn't change with the wrist movement. Now you have an interesting control problem, which we addressed a few years ago. This is Mark Jasonathadas, the lead author on that paper. We basically have the question, how does muscle activity, EMG, of these two very different set of muscles interact? And of course, a simplistic answer would be, well, if this length doesn't change of the intrinsic muscle, I couldn't care less. I just modulate the extrinsic muscle. But in fact, the truth is that both muscles coordinate their activity and their action, so as for the intrinsic muscle to compensate this mechanical behavior, which is induced by the wrist motion. Okay, so that takes me now to the next topic, which is that, as you know now, because of this mechanical peripheral factor, the ability to control independently your finger movement is limited. That's been known for a while. Mark Schieber was one of the first to actually identify this problem. He has done very, very elegant work, both in non-human primates and the humans. And so in those days, we were interested, when I was doing my postdoc, in addressing, this idea of independent motion of the fingers. So what we did was to ask subjects to shape the hand to imagined objects. And the reason why they're imagined is that we didn't want the hand to passively mold to the shape of the object, because then we wouldn't know what is, actively controlled and what's passively a byproduct of the hand molding to the shape of the object, right? And so these are 6 of what were, I believe, 57 objects that vary widely in shape and size. And this is just a rendering using a saber glove. We'll get a joint angles from the glove. And then this is just reconstruction of these postures. As you can see, even though they're imagined, we looked at the extent to which they were very distinct from each other. And sure enough, you could see just qualitatively that they're very, very different from each other. Whether you want to grasp a zipper or a beer mug, etc. And then we ask the question, since we have now the data for all the joints, to what extent are these joints really controlled independently? And so what we did, we looked at the covariation on joint angles. And so as you could see, we're doing a regression of each joint angle with the other, adjacent, from the same finger, from different fingers, etc. And the long story short is that you have certain joints that are highly correlated with each other, and these are static postures, by the way. You could see here in this diagonal, not so much within thumb and other joints, hardly any covariation within, say, the metacarpal of the thumb, etc. But when you see this pattern, you get a sense that, in fact, you have groups of joints that tend to go together and groups of joints that are more independent. But for sure, the level of independency among the joint angles is very limited. So you can quantify that by using principal component analysis. And what we found is that you can reconstruct the original data set with the first 3 to 4 principal components with a high level of accuracy. This is what the first component looks like, where you basically have an opening and closing of the hinge with all the joints moving in tandem. And then you have an orthogonal component, which is the second component, where now you start to see a little more individuation of certain joints, and so forth. Now, this, of course, and in our discussion, we were very careful in pointing out that this is clearly the byproduct of the constraints I mentioned earlier, which are peripheral, and possibly some neural constraints. But of course, you couldn't really tease that out with kinematic data. And so the last thing we're going to propose is that this is the way the brain represented this end at that time. And then more on the behavioral end of things, Mark Schieber and others, Mark Zatiorsky, Mark Hatash, Zatiorsky, and others, started to look at, actually quantifying the extent to which you can individuate these fingers. And so you could do this by asking subject to wiggle one finger at a time. And if you do that, you start to get this kind of data where 1 means that the finger is or the digit is highly independent, and less than 1 is less so. And so what you see is that the most screwed up finger, so to speak, as far as independent, is the ring finger, and with the middle and little finger following closely, and then the thumb and the index finger are pretty independent. You do that for the right hand, of course, the left hand. These are the summary data. And then Mark went a step further. At that time, we were working on parallel lines of investigation, meaning we were also interested in looking at the common input, the motor units of the hand receiver, as a potential factor that might be influencing the extent to which you can individuate finger motion or forces. And what he found, which I thought was very interesting, is that if you look at the separation between finger compartments, in this case, these are units within the same compartment, 0 separation, 1 compartment apart, 2 compartments apart, and 3 compartments apart. You see that the strength of the common input, which is the tendency for motor units of those compartments to fire together, gets weaker. There's a trend for getting weaker as these muscle compartments are further apart from each other, which is kind of an interesting observation. And so when I moved to ASU, I wanted to move out of the kinematic, at least for a while, and really look at the neural underpinning of these covariations. So we described it, but now went from a system kind of level approach, where we looked at the macroscopic feature of the hand posture. I went to the furthest extreme, which is motor units, and so individual motor units, and this is the work by Sarah Winges, Jimmy Johnson, and Craig Cornetz I'm going to describe here. And there were other authors, of course, Andy Fugleman, who taught me how to do intramuscular EMG. And so the idea was really to look at whether this particular framework of common input that is shared by motor neurons innervating different muscles, that's the key word. These are different muscles of the hand, and nevertheless might receive a common input. And so every time this common motor neuron fires, you would expect that the activity through interneuron, etc., premotor neurons, would ultimately lead to some kind of coordinated activation of the muscles. Now, this is a very simplistic way of explaining it, because in fact, as you know, motor neurons are bombarded by inputs. It's not going to be just one, right? And they're, of course, receive input from sensory afferents, etc. Nevertheless, the question was, well, if you measure the probability that 2 different, anatomically different muscles of the hand receive common input, that may not account for the independence or lack of independence of the fingers, but could at least be one of the mechanisms that could mediate that limited independence. So we did that, and so what we did was you insert needles or fine wires into the muscle fibers. In this case, it's a thumb muscle and a deep flexor muscle. This is the third compartment. And then you basically isolate one motor unit at a time. There's the firing rate. You do the discrimination of the motor units. And then you could ask the question of whether they are correlated in time. So you do a cross-correlogram, you measure the number of counts of spikes that tend to be synchronous or plus or minus, a few milliseconds jitter synchronous. And you can also analyze the coherence. So this would be the correlation in the time domain. This would be the correlation in the frequency domain, to capture two complementary aspects of that common input behavior here. So when you do that, and this is the is a summary figure of 2 or 3 papers that we wrote. What you find is that the distribution of common input is definitely not homogeneous. So we replicated data that we already know in terms of the within muscle synchrony is much higher than across muscles. But the interesting thing is that if you look at extensor muscles, which are extrinsic muscles here, you see that their tendency to go together in a synergistic fashion is higher, significantly higher, than when you look at intrinsic muscles with each other. So if you look at the cross-motor units of 2 small intrinsic muscles of the index finger, and what you see is that you have, 1/3, 1/3 to half the amount of synchrony that you see in muscles that are normally synergistic when you graph, say, a big object. So again, large forces, most of the time you tend to activate these muscles together, whereas small muscles within the hand, which are normally used for modulating fine forces and small forces and more precision kind of tasks, you see that they are characterized by the weakest common input. Again, this is kind of suggestive of the fact that this could be one of the mechanisms by which this common neural input reflect the functional demands that are imposed on these muscles. Okay, now if we want to move up from the periphery, we want to go to the cortex or the brain. This is a diagram from a really nice review by Scott Crafton about the cortical mechanisms associated with grasping. And the reason why I wanted to put it here is just to give you a sense of the richness of interactions that mediate grasping. And so this is a non-human primate brain. This contains the decades of research and results, etc. And you see that there are some major hubs here. There's one in V6A. There is one AIP. And then you see this interaction with premotor, supplementary, and motor areas. And this network has been associated with a number of things, including how do you select an action, where is this action vocabulary, so to speak, using the Rizzolatti wording, is located. Say, how do I look at, how do you select a precision versus power grip? What are those building blocks being assembled and then executed? How does visual information allow me to reach and grasp? All of this, as you could see, involves a very rich and complex network, which we're still learning about. So for those of you who are interested in neural mechanisms of grasping, I highly recommend this review. And then as you look at the cortex, one of the things that Mark Schieber pointed out is that, in fact, this cartoon that you see on the left, which most of us have seen in different shapes or forms, is that the neural representation of hand muscles, or finger, if you want, finger muscles, is somatotopically distributed, because what you tend to see is that you have this nice orderly distribution of little, ring, middle, index finger, and thumb. But based on everything I described so far, this seems like a fairly simplistic view, given that, as I mentioned before, you have common input, you have this peripheral constraints that prevents you from controlling one finger independently from the other. And so Mark Schieber was the first to point out that, maybe this picture is an oversimplified picture. So what he did was actually record from non-human primates as they exerted performed individuated finger movements and forces, the neural activity associated with this neuron population. So what you see here, and here at the bottom, I cite some of the work, not all the work, that Mark did, Mark and his group. And so what you see, these are raster plots of a particular neuron. So this one is one neuron. And what you see in each column is the movement of the finger that the monkey is asked to perform. And by the way, if you talk to Mark, you will also know that it's it's a lengthy process to train monkeys to do this kind of tasks. And so what you see just at a glance is that as you do multiple trials, and then you line up, the firing rate of that particular neuron, you see that this neuron seems to be interested, so to speak, or gets recruited, or is involved, however you want to say it, for the movement of the fifth finger, so the fifth finger flexion. But it also gets involved when you do two fingers simultaneously, which is the fourth and the fifth finger. If you look at the extension of a different finger, but you keep, this is a different neuron now. If you extend the second finger, this neuron fires, and it doesn't seem to care much about the other fingers. But then if you extend the first and the second, or the second and the third, you see again this neuron being active. And so, summarizing this enormous amount of work, what I describe here is called divergent, whereby a given neuron is involved in the activation of not always the same muscle, could be 2 or 3 multiple muscles in this particular case when you move a finger. But what you also reported is that different neurons can also be activated by the activation of a given muscle. So when you put these two phenomena together, now you realize that this particular picture really failed to describe the true physiology and organization of these neural representations for hand muscles. And then there is a really recent commentary that I also recommend by Schieber, where it gives kind of a summary view about sensory motor cortical representations, technical issues associated with the early description of these maps, current challenges in really describing how these representations are distributed in the cortex, etc. Very, very interesting commentary. And this is another very interesting paper. This is by the group of Jørgen Didriksen, who asked the question in humans, how are these different finger movements represented, or finger forces? So it is clear after the introduction I gave that this direct line kind of hypothesis where one neuron controls one muscle is clearly not realistic, it's not accurate. But so it opens up the question, so how are this cortical representation, first of all, how do they come about? And what are they related to? Are they related to movement, are they related to force? What is it? And so what he did, so the paper is actually fairly deep and fairly long. I'm just going to give you the highlights. So what he did, he asked subjects to perform first individuated finger forces, so one finger at a time. Then he looked at multi-digit forces, so these are some of the single digits. The white squares are the finger which is instructed to press on the sensor. Same here, but now you see different kind of patterns. And third, he used another data set which is now related to the natural hand use. This data set was collected by the Warpert group by asking subjects to wear a cyber glove all day, so for a number of hours every day. So doing, going about their daily activities, and you basically log all the data, throughout the day. And so this data set was used by Didriksen group to then ask the question whether the pattern of activity that I'm showing here in motor cortex, and also you looked at the primary somatosensory cortex, whether this particular activity here is related to either individual finger movements, so it's either somatotopic, is it related to muscle, he recorded EMG out of the scanner, doing the same tasks, or usage. Usage would be, can I describe the organization of these activation patterns in each subject's brain using this data set? These are the velocities of the fingers. And the long story short is that yes, the natural usage data did a much better job. Here the difference is not as large, but here it's much larger when you look at this isometric force tasks performance in describing the organization of these neural activation patterns in the motor cortex and sensory cortex. So one of the take-home messages of that paper, which is very, very interesting, is that even though if you look at individual subject brain activation patterns, they're very different from each other, which kind of matches this idea of natural usage because everybody's different. But what's interesting is that if you don't look at the actual map, but if you look at the relative distance in this activation foci, then you see there's a high similarity across subjects, and in fact can be explained better, again, by natural hand use than either muscles or movement, etc. So it's very, very interesting work. And then it just happened that almost simultaneously, there was another project run by Emiliano Ricciardi, who is now at IMT in Lucca in Italy. And I happened to be collaborating with Emiliano at that time, and now, on a project that was looking at also brain activation patterns, but we took a different kind of angle. And the angle that we had, as we were interested in kinematic synergies, was to look at whether, if you ask the question of, can I see an neural representation that can be explained by the first few principal components of static hand postures, whether you could see any of this distribution in the cortex. And so on the left, I'm showing that indeed you find this distribution, this kind of smooth representations of different principal components here. It's the first, the second, and the third. And you can see they're smoothly distributed across M1, S1, and other areas here. But then what you also did was to ask the opposite question. Can I reconstruct those synergies, the original posture that we measured, using these brain activation patterns? And you see the difference between the original posture that we measured experimentally and the posture that you reconstructed using the fMRI. This shows that, in fact, you could go both, you could encode, you could ask the question of encoding, but you could also do a decoding kind of exercise, so to speak. And this has some implications and potential application for BMI, brain-machine interfaces, where you could envision reconstruct a combination of postures using fMRI. And so this is also a different kind of angle from the angle that Didriksen took. We studied for a different question again on whether a reduced dimensionality of end movements, and these were static postures, could be observed in the activation pattern of the cortex. So that takes me to the summary of the first part, and that is that I started off by telling you a little bit about the main features of the biomechanics of the hand, in particular, constraints that tend to be at the peripheral level, and then how these peripheral constraints actually impact control. And then I moved all the way up to the controller, so to speak, in terms of how are these hand movements or finger movements represented. And unless there are questions, I'm going to move to the next part, which is now about diving a little deeper into the mechanisms of sensory motor learning and grasping. Okay, so let me start with grasping and dexterous manipulation. So grasping and dexterous manipulation in particular, as you well know...
Excuse me, Marco, I hate to interrupt you, but I'm slow on the clicking, but I wanted to know the representation of the movement postures is very interesting. I wanted to know, what about representation of intentions of those postures? So you had the grasp for tennis racket, but is that just the grasp posture, or is it the intention to make an action with the hand? Can you speak to that?
Mini, that's a great question, and I glossed over that detail, which is important. So both in the 1998 paper and in the paper with the fMRI data showed you, subjects were asked to imagine using the object. You're totally right. So there is both an intention of using, because intention, as you will see now in the next behavioral data, what you plan to do with the object has a huge impact on those activation patterns, right? Because you're presetting, stiffness, you're presetting what's going to happen next, etc. So to make, and again, that happened in both papers, also the Kinematics synergy paper, we asked the subject not just to mold the hand to mimic the object, but mold it as if they were going to use it. So yeah, does that answer your question? Yes, great, thank you. Okay.
So Marco, I have other questions. This is Richard and Emmerich. So did you actually compare, this is a follow-up to Mindy's, did you actually compare some of these imagined grasp to the real grasp that people would do?
Yes.
By holding the objects?
Yeah. So after 98, we did another study, I believe it was 2002. It got published, where we asked subjects to reach and grasp real objects. And we did that and contrasted that with, again, virtual imagined object as a control condition, and a condition where we use the concave mirror that will show the object visually, but it wouldn't have any physical, excuse me, it wouldn't have any haptic feedback once you touch it. And what we looked at the principal components that evolved in time, and there was hardly any difference between the three conditions. Now, it's also true that if you want to thought of this shortly after we did the 98 paper, if you mold your object around an object, then you get into the confound of you could get as many hand shapes as you want, very different from each other, if you let the hand passively mold to an object. So you will get more principal components there, simply because, if I get a crazy geometry, then your hand is going to get a very, it's going to be congruent with the geometry, as long as I mold my hand as best I can to the object. So, but the problem there is that you don't really know how much is you're controlling the particular configuration versus just letting the hand close as passively as you can to match the shape of the object. So we wanted to avoid that confound, but in general, although you can find different components with different designs, etc., I think the core message is that this is just one of several techniques that people have used to try to summarize or try to extract the commonalities in the hand postures, more than saying this is five components, this is 7.5, whatever. And so this is the idea. The idea is that you really want to understand. So to rephrase this, the way I've seen these principal components results all the way is that for me, I've always been the beginning of the question more than the answer, in the sense that after you put a number to this correlation pattern, I thought that the most interesting question was why. And that's how the work on the fMRI came up. This is how the work on the motor unit recording came up. To now try to tease out best you can the mechanism that give you that particular pattern, besides the obvious interaction of the peripheral factors.
This was actually a little bit of what I wanted to ask about this first part, this what it means. And you're hinting already that it's not clear that there is necessarily a real contraction, as the task actually entails using different combinations of finger postures and maybe coordinating them in time.
Yeah.
So it's natural that will be represented also in cortex. So this question, if it's a reduction, is not really answerable, right? Or what do you think about that?
I think it's partially answerable in the sense that the fact that you could find representation is intriguing, but at the same time, if you dive into the details, for example, in the fMRI data that I showed you, the one by Ricciardi, you explained 40% of the fMRI activity using principal components, which is, in a way, kind of expectable, because one thing I didn't mention, and also this is the same observation that goes for the Didriksen work, is that we are not talking at all about the spinal cord here. So there is clearly, this is a multi-level kind of process leading to a particular hand configuration or a particular force pattern. What that means is that, you might look, so what's interesting for me is really the interplay between the highest and the lowest level of the system. The fact that the fact that the representation in the cortex are shaped by hand usage is a fantastic observation. The fact that you could see combination of principal components being represented in the cortex is also interesting, but it's not the full story, because we still don't know how these descending commands end up generating these kinematic synergies. You might think that the spinal cord doesn't do much other than being selected by and activated selectively by the descending commands from this representation in the cortex. That's one way of thinking about it. Or you could say that, well, the real magic, so to speak, happens at the spinal cord level, where as a function of sensory inputs, you may shape this particular kinematic synergy differently for a given descending command. So it's clearly not the end of the story. And also there is, of course, a lot of work by the Beatsy group and others showing that, in fact, the spinal cord is critically important for the selection of these patterns. Some of these patterns just need to be selected by the cortex, right? So the story is definitely far from being over, because again, we still need that kind of transformation layer from the cortex to the muscle. And that's actually, I should also mention a work by Kazuhiko Seki in Japan, has done very elegant work in this, looking at how premotor neurons might impact in non-human primates the selection of particular hand synergies. So that's also very, very interesting work. Is that good? Okay, I'll move forward. And by the way, I cannot see the chat box, so if you ask me a question, if you give me, an okay or something, if you tell me move on, I'll keep going. Okay, so everything I said so far has mostly been in the domain of, postures and kinematics, mostly. But, if you think about it, grasping and manipulation involves not just shaping the hand to the object, not just figuring out where to grasp the object or what to do with the object, but, the implementation of grasp and manipulation, where now you move an object from one location to another, implies a time course of commands that leads to the development of forces and torques that allows you to get the task done. And the pioneer of this work, as everybody knows, is Johansson, who pioneered, in the same way in which Marc Jeanneret pioneered the study of kinematics that Jeroen reviewed in his talk, so did Johansson for the study of grasping and manipulation from the perspective of kinetics. So you see a classic picture here where the subject grasps an object. These are instrumented objects with 4 sensors. You see a cutout here where the experimenter may change, unbeknownst to the subject, the weight. Lift the object several times, and then you switch the weight, and then you see how the subject reacts with the force responses, etc., etc., etc. Johansson also did, and until very recently with Andrzej Prosinski, also very elegant work on the decoding of inputs from tactile efforts. So it's done really incredible amount of work, has had a great impact in a lot of research labs, including my own. So what I'm showing here is a task whereby you lift an object, you do that several times consecutively, then the experimenter changes the object, the mass, and then you lift it several times consecutively, and so on and so forth. And so what I'm plotting here is the load force, which is the vertical force you're exerting to lift the object. This line is lift off, and you see the position of the object here, the vertical velocity. And then what you see here is the ramping up of forces as a function of the object mass. And these are the load forces, the grip forces, the squeezing force, so to speak, the normal force exerting the object. And then you take the derivatives. This is the position of the object, the derivatives of all these variables. So 2 observations. One is that way before you lift the object, you see this nice scaling of grip and load forces. And the answer is, the reason why you do so is that you expect the weight to be the same as the previous trial. So you can certainly use sensory motor memory, the way the term that Johansson coined, and therefore you set up for lifting the object in a way that the object doesn't slip. So this is fantastic, right? You can say it's fairly repeatable across trials. Fantastic. You take the derivative, and then you could see that it looks semi-bell-shaped, bell-shaped profile, which in motor control literature is usually looked at as an indicator of feed-forward ballistic kind of commands, right? And so this is great. And so the idea is that you can do this because you develop a memory. You develop a memory that then has been rephrased in multiple ways, into models, etc. But the bottom line is that you've done something, you know what's going to happen next, you set your forces according to what you did before, and you keep doing it. And so one key thing to note here is that they're very consistent across trials, right? And you could say they're very distinct also from each other. So this is great. However, a few years later, we started to think about a different problem, and that is that in the real world, this kind of setup, even though it's been instrumental in providing a lot of insights, is not very typical, meaning that, as Mindy already alluded to, what I want to do with an object matters. I could have the same object, say a bottle, what I want to grasp it to drink from it, what I want to grasp it to pour liquid from it, will lead to different postures. And in fact, we actually did that study. And so we decided to look at this particular problem. How do you modulate digit position to the object features or task in this case? The task is actually the same. We're changing the center of mass distribution. So we did this in the poor man's way, which is a Pringles box, no sensors. And we put markers, and then we ask the subject, we have 3 different slots here. You put a mass of 400 grams, and then you ask the subject to use all fingertips, 5 digits, to lift the object straight. So when the mass is in the center, no problem. When the mass, which the subject cannot see, this is hidden from view, is either on the left or the right, the object is going to tilt, but the test requirement is lift the object as straight as you can. Don't let it tilt. Of course, the first time it's going to tilt because you don't know, you cannot see it. Second time, third time, similar to this, you see these nice trajectories that now indicate that people can plan ahead of time. Now, what you see is that if you look at just the black lines, because we also did an unpredictable task condition, which is irrelevant now, but if you look at the predictable, which means you're lifting this object 10 times consecutively, what you see is that for the left center of mass distribution, you put the thumb higher and the index finger lower than when you go to the right center of mass. And so now you see this nice trend, which indicates with the finger being modulated, but not to the same extent as the largest force producers, thumb and index finger. So what you get from this is that even before you lift the object, you anticipate the torque and try to take advantage of the moment arm that having these different digit positions can afford you with. In a way, this is an anticipatory control of position in the same way in which this captures anticipatory control of forces. So at this point, we paused and we started to discuss, how do we actually combine anticipatory control of force and anticipatory control of contact points? And this is the work, should I mention earlier that this work here was done by Jimmy Lucas and Caterina Anzuini. At that time, she used to work with Umberto Castiello in Padova. And so here come Qiushi Fu and Wei Zhang. You're going to see Qiushi's name a lot in this presentation because a lot of the work I'm going to review came from him. And Wei was a trainee with Mark Latache. And so we started to think about a task that would be a little more complicated than Johansson, meaning that in Johansson, the problem is that you need to prevent the object from slipping. We wanted to have a task that would allow a dexterity component to it, which is what I showed you before. The object cannot tilt. Okay, and by the way, the task was developed by Andy Gordon originally. The only change that we did to it was to allow subjects to modulate their contacts. And so we wanted a task that could allow us to capture modulation of both positions and forces and allow them to choose the context. So we don't want to constrain the context like as done in the classic paradigm developed by Johansson. So for that, Qiushi designed this object where now you have, again, 3 slots here, which the subject cannot see. You put the mass. But now we put the sensors mounted on long bars. So now you can grasp anywhere here. This is like 14 centimeters, fairly long. And depending on how you want to perform the task, you put the fingers wherever you want. But this is just thumb and index finger. And the reason why we only use 2 fingers is that we wanted to get a complete biomechanical description. This is the free body diagram where you see the different contact points that you would use for a mass on the left. And then we measured the distance between the finger contact points, which we derived from the 6-dimension force torque sensors. And then basically the task that the brain has to solve is that there is a torque acting on the object in this direction. I need to exert a torque opposite to the external torque, and I need to do so before the object is lifted. What that means is that if I lift the object straight, try to lift the object straight without exerting a torque to lift off, I wouldn't be able to do the task because of reaction time delays, etc. So, similar to Johansson, I need to set in an anticipatory fashion my torque so that at lift off, it roughly matches the external torque so that the object can be lifted straight. So this dexterity component of position of the object control is critical in this task. That's what we're actually looking for as a measure of learning. And then this is the task goal, what I just said, which is to lift the object straight. At lift off, you need to make sure that the external torque is matched by the torque they exert, the moment they are exerted, which we call compensatory torque. This is the equation that describes the MCOM. So this is what you need to do. And what you need to do, which is this component here, which is torque here, can be broken down by the vertical forces acting on this horizontal distance, which is one component of the torque, as well as the normal component of the forces acting at different contact points, which also generate the torque. And the sum of all these components, which again are modulated by where you put the fingers on the vertical direction, will give you the compensatory torque. So this is what I need to figure out every time I lift the object if I want to lift it straight. And then we contrasted this scenario with, let's call it the constrained grasp scenario, where now we do exactly what people have done for a couple of decades, where now you put the contacts, facing each other. They are small, the dimensions of the sensor, same task, lift the object straight, everything is identical, with the only difference being that you cannot choose where to put the fingers. And so as you could see now, the free body diagram shows that plus or minus a small amount of finger pad roll on the sensors, these contact points tend to line up for the most part. And so as you can imagine, now you go from this, where you have a component that can now take advantage of dy, which is the vertical distance between the contacts. dy now approaches 0. So now the only way you could do the task is to have a load force here, which is larger than the load force here. That will give you the torque. So you could do the task in two different ways, and you can still do it well, but you gotta do it differently. So this is what the data looks like. And you see that this, I believe, the third or fourth lift. So this is lift off. This is the position, the vertical position of the object. This is small object roll, which is our measure of your ability to anticipate the torque. The smaller the peak roll of the object, the better you are at anticipating the external torque and setting the force in position accordingly. Now, when you let the subject choose where to put the fingers, you notice that for a left center of mass, they tend to put the thumb higher than the index finger. And they do so at contact and stays that way during the lift. Grip forces are roughly identical, as they should be. But now you see that these load forces tend to be different during the lift. And also they tend to separate here, the better you get at this before the lift. And in fact, there is a covariation between dy, which is the distance between these two contacts, and the difference between the load forces, as you will see in a moment. So now, for the first time, we have a description of what people do when they have the ability of choosing contact points and change forces accordingly. This shows simply that subject can learn this, so not a big deal. We were expecting people to learn it. And as you could see on the first trial, because they cannot see the torque, there's a big error, which is this blue line. Then they recover a reaction time and they straighten the object. They don't exert any torque, which is the dotted black line, because again, they don't expect a torque. On the second trial, you see what you would predict from Johansson's work. That is, they start to anticipate the torque, but they're still not quite sure what the amount of torque should be. But nevertheless, this little bit allows you to minimize the error. And by trial 5, you see that the error is almost 0, and you see that you start to exert a torque here, and then it ramps up until the object lifts. So this is what we were expecting to find. The question was, how do you get to this torque given the multiple ways in which you can combine force and position? And so this is how subjects do it. So this is on the first trial. You cannot tell the difference between any of these variables, of course. But as you start to practice, you start to see that the thumb is above the index finger for the left center of mass, vice versa for the right, and they face each other for the center. Low forces tend to covary with the center of pressure. Great forces are randomly, they change randomly, even though they do matter when it comes to the torque. So here's the bottom line, is that what we found looking at this data is that, yes, they can learn the task both in the constrained and unconstrained fashion, the same amount of trials, no problem. But there was a major difference, and the difference was that even after you learn the torque, say after the 4th trial, which is here, and now you really learned it, you're consistent, you're done, you figured it out. If you follow what happens to the contact points from trial 4 to trial 10, we noticed that there was quite a bit of variability across trials in where you put your fingers. And then we reasoned that, wait, but this could be a problem, because if every time you grasp the object at a slightly different position, you insist using the same forces that you used before, the torque will not come out to be the torque that you need. So the task will be unlearnable, but we're showing that subject learning it despite the variability in digit position. So one thing we could say is that for sure, if you use the memory mechanism for force control, you wouldn't be able to do the task. We knew that. So then the question was, how do you do it? And this is how subject did it. On a trial-to-trial basis, as the distance between the centers of pressure of the fingers changes from trial to trial, they modulate the forces in an anticipatory fashion, that is before liftoff, in a linear manner. Now, and this is true both for the center of mass in the unconstrained case and for the other 2 centers of mass. Now, what we found striking and what got us excited and led us to do several other studies after this is that this phenomenon occurs within 300 milliseconds, 350 milliseconds. That is from touch to liftoff. You are changing the forces according to the new position of the fingers, not to what you used before. And that, so you don't use neither the same position exactly, nor the same forces. So, but the fact that you scale forces as a function of the actual position, it's a, it's a really nice result, but it opens up other questions. How do you actually do this? So we came up with this very simple theoretical framework where we contrast a constrained grasp with an unconstrained grasp. So if you break down the problem in the reaching, contact, force development, lift off, and holding, we thought, okay, so based on Johansson's work, based on our work, clearly you could do this in a very consistent fashion by using sensory motor memory. But we put the caveat that this is true only if the planned finger position happens to match the actual position. For the unconstrained case, which is the one I showed you, sensory motor memory itself alone wouldn't do. So you need to add another mechanism here, which is, we proposed, is the feedback of fingertip position. If you have feedback of fingertip position, this might help scaling the forces. Of course, we don't know how, but we reason that if you're scaling forces to position, you gotta have a mechanism, whether it be visual, whether it be tactile, whether it be proprioception, whatever that might be, but clearly you need to scale forces to a position, and somehow you need to understand what it is. And this mechanism of scaling forces to position will be primarily involved when the grasp is unconstrained. So you need to, and that means that if the planned fingertip position, you realize that they're not matching what you planned, if what you're doing don't match what you planned, then this is where the feedback of finger position will help you to get the forces you need to get. What we did was, and this again is usual with a PhD student at that time, Kevan Mojitahedi, who then did a project, which is this one here. Well, now we ask the question, well, if this is true, we should be able to see some differences in the rate of force profile. Why? Remember the Johansson data, where I showed you that when you use sensory motor memory, you have this you have something that approaches a bell-shaped profile. It's noisy, but nevertheless, looks like a bell-shaped profile because it's ballistic, etc. And so if you do look at constrained grip force rates, this is what they look like. And if you fit a Gaussian, and we also did continuous wavelet transform analysis, which I won't have the time to describe here, what you see is that, in fact, it matches pretty well a bell-shaped curve. So this is, again, nothing new relative to what people have described before. The new part is this, that if I have an unconstrained grasp, all of a sudden, the nice shape of the grip force rate is not there anymore. You still have this kind of ballistic kind of profile, but you also have a lot of ripples. You have something that you may want to define as corrective responses. That's one way of looking at it. But it's clearly not as nicely shaped and continuous as this one. And so these two observations might not prove that we're using this mechanism, but nevertheless, they're consistent with the idea that here is mostly, not only, mostly memory-based, and here is mostly feedback-based. So to go a little further, we use the same theoretical framework to design a TMS study. Marco Davare, who was mentioned also by John Rothwell in his TMS work, helped us to set up the TMS lab a few years ago. And Pranab Parekh was involved in this and follow-up studies I'm going to describe in a moment. So what we thought of doing was to use TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, single pulse, to assess the modulation of corticospinal excitability in the two types of tasks. So we would deliver TMS shortly after contact in the condition where the contacts are constrained by the experimenter and contrasted with the unconstrained grasping, and then track the corticospinal excitability, and we also did that during the reach to assess whether these differences emerge before contact, in other words, require some kind of touch information, and if not, then you might be able to see differences even when you do TMS during the reach. And so this is the design, same setup, same object, same task. The only difference is that we used constrained contacts that were designed based on what they naturally chose, what the subject naturally chose in the unconstrained case. So we put tapes, and we asked them to grasp here. And then we deliver TMS either mid-reach or after contact, as I showed you earlier. And so these are the behavioral results, which basically replicate what I showed you earlier. That is that there is this covariation between normalized in the unconstrained case is much stronger than the constrained case, where you see this nice variation of force as a function of position is much more variable than in the constrained case. Again, nothing new. But the new data is that the FDI, which we used only the right center of mass here, which is important for the torque development, during the reach, and we measure CSC, corticospinal excitability across different muscles, thumb muscles, little finger muscle, and the wrist muscle. As you can see, the FDI is the only muscle which functionally is the muscle which is most involved in this task. You see that there is a significant difference of FDI only when you probe CSC shortly after the contact, which suggests that this theoretical framework whereby there is a greater involvement of feedback-mediated processes as opposed to memory could be captured by these differences in corticospinal excitability. So again, this is work by Pranab Parekh, as well as Justin Fine and Patrick McGurran. And after these results, we then started to think about how can we causally probe this network. And we started to think that, of course, as you remember from the slides I showed you earlier, the graph circuit is very, very large and complex. However, in our framework, where we put out the simple prediction that when you unconstrain the contacts, you're using more feedback. When you constrain them, you're using mostly memory. You should be able to tell a difference in the involvement between, say, primary motor cortex and primary sensory cortex. And the problem that we had in looking at the literature is that all the work that looked at neurorepresentation of grasping, using fMRI, using EEG, TMS, etc., all of the studies have looked at constrained grasping. So we couldn't really use any of the literature to understand whether M1 and S1 have a different interplay in these two grasps. And so we designed the study ourselves. And so because of what I just reviewed, and that is that when you allow choice of contact points, you have differences in brain activation. Actually, I will review this one, but this is the work by Scott Grafton that I collaborated with. There's some clear differences between constrained and unconstrained. What I showed you earlier was there are differences in cortical spinal excitability, but neither study really tells us anything about this causal role, primary motor and somatosensory cortices. And so this is why we designed the study, and we also added EEG to also look at some kind of baseline activation pattern that would then tell us what TMS would then causally establish. And the way we use TMS was to elicit virtual lesions, and I'm lucky that John Rothwell already described what that means, the mechanics of it, etc., because we followed exactly what he did in his work and others. And so the hypotheses that we had were the following. In the constraint grasping, which has been the go-to model used by a lot of labs, we knew, based on previous work which is cited here, that M1 would mostly be involved in storing and retrieving sensory motor memory digiforces. We knew that from the literature, so this was not the question, but we needed to make sure that we will be able to replicate that work. And S1, in contrast, doesn't seem to be involved in a significant manner in this particular process. And intuitively, it kind of makes sense, given that if you can use and rely on your memory on every trial, S1, of course, is not dead, but S1 is known, for example, to be involved in reactive responses, corrections, together with spinal mechanisms, etc. But as far as controlling forces per se, if you have a sensory motor memory mechanism that drives that particular behavior, then you wouldn't expect S1 to play a key role. But we contrasted that hypothesis with a new hypothesis, which is that when you don't constrain the contacts, both areas are involved in the digit force to position modulation, as I showed you earlier. But at the same time, we expected each area to be responsible for very different functions. The sub-hypothesis here is that S1 will relay somatosensory feedback about digit position to M1, and M1 will process this feedback to modulate digit forces. If this is true, if you generate a virtual lesion to M1 or S1, should interfere with the phenomenon of digit force to position modulation. But the virtual lesion to M1, but not S1, in the constrained grasping case, should only impact the retrieval of digit forces. Again, the top is based on previous literature. This is based on our theoretical framework that I described earlier. So for the EEG protocol, we looked at first 10 lifts of the unconstrained grasp. Then we looked at the modulation of contact points that then we used to constrain the contacts in a subject-specific manner. And then they did 30 lifts in constrained, 30 lifts unconstrained, and then we flipped the order for a different group of subjects. And then the TMS protocol, which is based on standard procedures. So what we did, these are the parameters with the CTBS, with the 3 pulses at 50 hertz, repeated every 200 milliseconds, 40 seconds. This is John's work. And what we did was, we looked at constrained and unconstrained for the experimental conditions, meaning that you learn the task, you lift it 10 times, take 5 minutes break, lift it 15 times, then get either single pulse and CTBS, 5 minutes break, and then you do post-CTBS assessment. And the 5 minutes rest is necessary because it takes time for the effect of CTBS to start to appear. But we also put it here to make sure that it wasn't the break that would cause any decrement in performance following CTBS. So this kind of break is kind of a controlled condition within the experimental conditions. We delivered CTBS to M1 and S1 in both grasp conditions, but we also had to do a number of control conditions for specificity, for auditory artifacts, for just looking at the effect of a single pulse with no CTBS, no stimulation, to just look at what happens as a function of just doing the task in these particular conditions, and no move. We use a single pulse, CTBS, single pulse, but there is no movement in between. Okay, so these are all the control groups, different subjects, because you cannot have the subject do multiple times this learning and pre and post, because then you wouldn't be able to interpret the data. But so total, we had 100 subjects across the study. Okay, so EEG. With EEG, we focused on M1 and S1 because these are the areas that we wanted to understand how they interact in conv versus uncon grasping. And at a glance, you see that there is a difference in the power, both in M1 and S1, when you compare constraint and unconstrained, which by itself is kind of interesting, but not particularly insightful, because it doesn't really tell us anything other than, okay, there's more power, but it's close to impossible to interpret. However, the real result is this. Our theoretical framework predicted, or at least implied, that in unconstrained grasping, S1 should exert a greater influence on M1 than in the constrained grasping. And by applying Granger connectivity analysis, this is exactly what we found. We found that only in the unconstrained case, you have this connectivity to be stronger than in the constrained case. And the reversal from M1 to S1 was identical between the two. So this, again, is consistent with this framework that S1 is playing a greater role in the unconstrained, the constrained grasp. But that takes us now to the causal probing using CTBS. And so this is the design that you've already seen before. You learn the torque. You learn the torque here. Takes you 2-3 trials. Then you settle to the desired torque, which is this one. People are never like dead on the desired torque, but significant improvement here. Rest, test them again, no decay in performance here, pre and post. Not CTBS here. And then you see now that there is a 5 minutes rest again, no decrement in performance. And then we validated the CTBS protocol by also looking at the suppression of corticospinal excitability. And what you see here is that in the no-move condition, which replicates the work by John, you see that there is a significant drop in excitability, not so much so for the other conditions. And the reason why we had to do the no-move condition is to verify that, in fact, when there is movement involved, the drop is not as strong as when there is no movement. But this is also consistent with John's work that shows that, in fact, if there is some kind of motor action involved after CTBS, the drop in corticospinal excitability is not as pronounced as when you do the no-move. So when you put together this data and this data, you conclude that, okay, the CTBS protocol is solid, the control conditions are not introducing any random effects of these blocks, breaks, etc. So now we can look at the experimental results. And what you see is that, again, you see the same kind of trend that I showed you before, but now we do CTBS. And what you see is that now what you attain here as the compensatory torque is not there anymore. The black line is the only condition, which is the vertex, which is a control condition. Of course, nothing happens. But the other condition, you see a significant change in the compensatory torque for all the experimental conditions. And you can analyze that. Improvement in torque here during the learning. And you see that in the very first trial, after the CTBS, the vertex condition is significantly different from all the others. But after 5 trials, you see that only one condition is significantly different from the vertex and the others, which I've already covered. And that is the M1 constraining condition. And I will tell you in a moment, but we'll try to interpret why in a moment. So if you pause here for a second, you would say, okay, well, I've done CTBS, and I see this messy pattern here. Probably all I did was to introduce some noise that makes no sense, but just for a moment, I basically interfered with the ability to recover some memory, maybe to use some position feedback, whatever that might be. But if you look at this data, it's close to impossible to make any sense of this, in the sense that you don't really know exactly what you did. But one of the advantages of the task that we used is that, in fact, this is a global variable. As you remember, this torque is the result of the interaction and coordination of multiple variables, in particular position and force. So this, by having a task that allows you to dissect all the individual components of this global variable, allowed us to go a little deeper and say, okay, so I can see that there is an effect on the torque. I want to see what happens on the torque components. And that's what we did. So what I'm plotting here is the trial before and after CTBS. The pre is in red here, the post is in black. Pre is I'm not sure what color you're gonna see, light blue, and the post is in black. So if you remember, and then I'm just showing these variables here just to remind you what they are. DLF is the difference between the load forces. FGF is the average of the grip forces. And dy is the vertical distance between the center of pressure. In the constraint case, remember, the center of pressure face each other, so it's close to 0. Normal forces face each other, and the only way you could do the task is that this finger exerts more force than this finger, and the load force. The first hypothesis was that, which again came from the literature, is that M1 should be basically, if it's responsible for storing and retrieving memory, you shouldn't be able to generate the same forces following CTBS that you exerted before. And this is exactly what we found. After CTBS, you see that the forces now are different, significantly different. And so as a result, this would impact, if you remember the equation of the torque, this would impact the torque because I'm also affecting the load forces right here. When you apply CTBS to S1 in the constraint case, you see no effect whatsoever. There's just a little more noise here in the position, which again, discuss later if there's time, but overall S1 CTBS didn't seem to do much in the constraint case. Now this is basically confirmatory of previous literature. But this is the new data, the new results. What happens when you do unconstrained grasping? So now remember, the center of pressures do change significantly. Forces are exerted at different contacts. And load forces need not be asymmetrical now because you have also a contribution of the normal torque. Now the hypothesis was that both M1 and S1 are involved in digit force to position modulation. And what you see here is that in the unconstrained M1 CTBS, you see this large difference in the position of the fingers, which is not compensated by the change in force. And this leads to a significant difference again in the compensatory torque. If you deliver CTBS to S1 in the unconstrained condition, you see that the only variable which is significantly affected is the distribution of load forces, which happens to be the force that is normally modulated to trial changes in position. So both hypotheses were confirmed, but of course you could say, but wait, this is just the first trial after CTBS. This could be a transient phenomenon. How do I know that, this is true? And you're showing differences between conditions, but do those differences, remain? And so we also did an analysis whereby we looked at what happens from the first trial post-CTBS to the 15th trial post-CTBS. And what you see, these are the significant differences I showed you before in each variable of the compensatory torque. And these are the different trends, which you could see they have very different profiles. But the statistics consisted of looking at the difference. What I'm showing you here is the difference between what you did pre and what you did post CTBS. So if it's 0, it means that nothing happened due to CTBS. If it's above or below 0, then there is a difference. What you see is that this is the recovery rate, so to speak, of going back to 0. And you could see that for M1 constraints, the large effect that we saw, remember that the effects on the compensatory torque stayed for a long time, they never recover. So they last for the whole 15 trials and beyond. Other variables, like the distribution of load forces, here and here, as you could see, they tend to recover much faster. Same for the distance in position, the difference in position here and here in S1 column. So when you look at this pattern, you realize that there's something real about the difference of the effect of CTBS for a given area as a function of grasp context. So that leads us then to the revised conceptual framework. So what you see here is the the framework, the predominant framework based on sensory motor memory. As I mentioned earlier, of course, we know that the circuit is large. We know that premotor and parietal areas are involved. But if you look at M1, if you're using a memory-based control of digit placement, which implies that there is no difference between plan and real position, if that is true, then you'd be using memory, which lead to memory-based control over forces and grid forces. So this, again, is nothing new. The new part is this, where now, if there is a difference between plan and actual position of the fingers, then you are forced, if you want to do the task right, to modulate the force to position, which implies you need to have a feedback mechanism to tell you where the fingers are in space, which would then allow you to modulate those forces, not so much or not so consistently grid forces, because as we know experimentally, grid forces tend to be more of a default kind of pattern. So this has been reviewed in a book chapter. Jeroen also wrote a chapter in the book, and this also showed up in bioarchives last year and just got published in cerebral cortex. Okay, so this time for the summary of this part. And so as you saw, we combined, the behavioral work kind of led us to do some psychophysics, then followed up by TMS and EEG. When you combine all of these approaches and the results, our take-home message is that the choice of contacts is a very important component of dexterous manipulation. And this is something also Aaron pointed out in his talk in the kinematic domain. And, that goes beyond this idea that, you're modulating fingertip distance, for example. But then, to move it to the next phase, which is, okay, I make contact, but now I need to exert forces that allow me to do the task. Once you start to choose grasp contacts, it forces you to now switch mechanisms from a memory to a system that also, not alternatively, also uses some feedback of digit placement, because now you got to change forces in proportion to what the fingers are. And now this opens up another kind of interesting area, which I will describe in the next section. And that is that something I didn't really mention too much, but if you think about it, the torque they're exerting is the high-level effector-independent, might be an effector-independent representation of Lorentz manipulation. Why? Because it doesn't matter what the fingers are, you're still getting the task right. The task right means I'm still getting the torque that I need to get the object straight, regardless of whether there is some variability in the position, in the forces, etc. It's an interesting take, which I will elaborate in a moment. And then I will conclude this summary by saying that, based on the data we have, it looks as if introducing the choice of contacts brings up different mechanisms, in particular this interplay between M1 and S1, and of course it involves other areas, but the areas we looked at seem to invoke M1 S1 interaction in a context-dependent manner. Okay, that takes me to the last part of my talk, where I'd like to spend a few minutes telling you.
Marco, could I ask a question? It's John Rothwell here.
Yeah. Yes.
So it's obviously a question about the TMS experiment. So I was sort of surprised in a way that the TMS of S1, it didn't interfere in the unconstrained grasping with the positioning of the fingers on the object.
Yes.
So I thought it might do, because it might not interfere on the first trial, but after the first trial, I thought it might interfere with the finger position on subsequent trials, because you would have normally needed your sensory input to remember where the finger position ought to be. Correct.
So that's a fantastic observation. So the way we discuss this is that there could be, position unlike forces visually.
Yeah.
So vision can help. It might not substitute for touch. It doesn't. But when it comes to positioning the fingers, it is possible that there is a high level of compensation because of the vision feedback that you have when you drive the fingers to the object. We did find, even though it was not statistically significant, because there was a lot of cross-trial variability in the two conditions, we did see a tendency, as you point out, for a change in position. So we believe that there could be an interaction, in the recovery phase. That was the first trial. In the recovery phase, we believe that maybe vision of position might actually help in zeroing in to a position that allows you to do the task better. But again, we don't know for sure. But that's one interpretation that we gave, that for sure. And so this also brings up the point that I tried to emphasize earlier, that we're not claiming that it's either memory or feedback. What we think is happening is that the relative weight of each changes depending on the graph's context.
Right. Yeah. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you. Okay. If there are no more questions, I'm going to move to this third part. And so what I find interesting is that in this high-level representation business, so to speak, this is something that's been brought up by Mindy, has been brought up by Heron, and I'm sure it's probably going to be brought up by others as we move on to the summer school. But this is a diagram that shows what I just mentioned, and that is that, at the end of the day, what you care for is to generate that torque. And our data suggests that regardless of what happens to the position of the fingers, you still get it done. So at the peripheral level, we can describe this covariation, which is similar to the uncontrolled manifold framework, where as long as this covariation happens along the line of the torque, you get the task done. Great. And we said, well, you could switch mechanism depending on whether you are aware or somehow in the system knows whether the planned position matches the actual position. And then you develop the forces accordingly. This is coherent and consistent with the neural data I showed you, but there is a part here which is even more intriguing, and that is that you must have, to drive the correlation of force as a function of position, you need to have this high-level representation very well established, which you establish by trial and error, of course, but at some point, you need to know when the torque is correct. And so you need to have this kind of high-level representation of the torque, which doesn't seem to care that much about where the fingers are.
Marco,
so,
may I ask you this question now? So until now, when you are describing everything at the level of peripheral mechanics, everything was fine. Now you are putting this mechanics into the brain, and of course, we're going to ask questions, how much of it is actually in the brain and how much of it is a consequence of changes in the kinematics of the movement, because when you position your fingers differently, your relative lengths of different muscles changes. So if you buy into the idea of reference coordinate in space, the same reference coordinates would produce you different torques, different forces produced by individual muscles and different torques. So how confident are you that somewhere in the brain there is really a representation of torques, rather than it's a representation of reference coordinates, and sometimes if the position of the fingers do not change, it leads to different torque production. However, if you change the position of the fingers, you may still have the same representation of reference coordinates, and torques will change in a secondary fashion.
Yeah, so so the two interpretations are, so what you're saying is compatible with, in terms of how it would show up in the behavior, with, either you have a reference configuration or you have, even though, the way these are represented in the brain will be different, but the net results will be the same. So I agree that it's impossible at this point to tell whether we even have a representation of torque per se, but I would rather say that we have a representation of the task, and I understand it's not compatible with the reference configuration hypothesis, but
No. Representation of the task is okay. Of course, at some high level, we have a representation where we kind of know what we want to do.
Yes.
And so at this very, very conceptual level. And the question is now what kind of tools you're using. What kind of signal, what is encoded in signals from the brain? Torques is very unlikely, as we know, because torques do depend on peripheral kinematics.
Yeah,
so you cannot encode torques.
I totally agree. I'm not advocating for a new representation of torque or force or mass per se.
You just in your picture, that's what.
Well, in this, Yeah, this is very task dependent though. So this is to me, the compensatory torque is the task, because in this particular case, they overlap, meaning that if I did a different task that involved force, then I would call it force, but in this particular case, it's a design manipulation task, or the goal of the task, which is the high-level representation. The compensatory torque is what happens to be the case for our task. But the high-level representation could be anything that you want to put here, whatever the task requires to do. But the point of this is that this is disengaged. So this drives, two things are happening, right? One is that it is disengaged from the periphery, from the perspective that the periphery can change, and you still get the goal of the task accomplished. And yet, to get the task accomplished, you need this kind of communication with the high-level representation, otherwise you wouldn't know what you're doing or what you're doing right. So it's this flow that is not clear how it's actually implemented at the neural level. And this is what the behavior can only tell you that, yeah, you might have. So the behavior I'm going to describe in a second says that there are task conditions where this high-level representation of the task is transferable and you can handle it. And there are conditions where you cannot handle it. So yeah, in this particular case, it happens with the torque, but it doesn't have to be the torque. I mean, it's a goal of the task.
Oh, okay, so all right, so we'll take torque with a grain of salt. That this is not what's sitting in the brain.
Right.
All right. Okay, thanks.
No problem. And so this again work by Kyushi and Zia Hassan, that everybody knows in this group. Did a sabbatical in our lab, and we worked together on this paper. And this shows, the instantiation of what I was saying here. That is, you learn the torque with the same task I showed you earlier with 3 digits. And then I ask you to switch to 2 digits. And now, biomechanics is a very different problem from the periphery, because now I have 2 contacts, not 3. The distribution of the contacts is different, of course, but also distribution of the forces is different. Now, recall that I measured this data at liftoff, and the time it takes me to get to this data from contacts is, again, 350 milliseconds at most. So as I switch from 3 to 2 digits, or 2 to 3, we did that too, you see there is hardly any effect on the compensatory torque that you learned. Now, one way, and again, this is similar to what Arun was describing about his models, right? This model, or this model per se, cannot really tell us about the inner details, representation, etc., for sure. But at the purely behavioral level, this kind of framework seems to predict that, the high-level representation, in this case the torque, but could have been another element of the task, pretty much doesn't care about the different implementation of the biomechanical level. Now, we follow this paper or task, and this again is a repeat of what Kyushi did in 2010 with Andy Gordon at Columbia University. We've been collaborating for years. This is just one of the papers that we did together, where we asked the question, okay, is this true not only when you switch, not only when you do 2 digits, but also when you have a larger number of digits? Because now, position of the center of pressure can be changed both by changing the position of the fingers, but also by changing the distribution of the forces. And sure enough, you see a very similar pattern when you use 5 digits for left, center, and right center mass. So this together and this says, okay, opens up a question. At the behavioral level, we know that the system can take the variability in the contact points pretty well, which again could be accounted for by the fact that the high-level representation doesn't really care about how you implement it, as long as this high-level representation goal is fulfilled by this different combination of variables. So that's one way of looking at it. But then we looked at this observation and started to think, okay, but you're learning a task, you're learning a mapping between force and position. How stable are the representations? How stable are those mapping when the context of the graph changes? And so this opened up studies by Wei and Kyushi. You've probably seen this before, but basically you rest the object several times, 8 times, say the center mass on the left, and the subject rotates it without lifting it, and now the center mass goes from left to right. and you're asked to again minimize the object roll. So this is the torque that you get, at the end, the trial number 8 of this condition, and this is what you should be getting if you transfer the torque completely. This does require to change the sign of the torque, and that's where you should be. But look at what subjects do. They exert the torque in the wrong direction and hardly any torque. They say, okay, this is a matter of practice. So you do another 8 trials. The last rotation, you get kind of the direction, but you're still way far from where you should be. So, of course, you could say, yeah, but this is kind of a weird task, right? I mean, who does this? But at the same time, it allows us to, as I did for the TMS study, dissociate the torque from, across the components. And so we could look what components suffered the most in the lack of transfer. But then with Justin Fine, we also looked at the EEG correlates of this. It's just an example to show you that you can associate particular frequency bands, in this particular case, sensory motor beta, to different type of errors. So on the x-axis, I'm plotting the error in the torque. So the error is the difference between what you're supposed to do versus what you actually did. And you can see that some of the transfer trials don't, in this particular power modulation, doesn't care, doesn't really, it's not really sensitive to the error magnitude, but the initial learning is. So this is what you see as you learn in the first block. And the analysis is much more extensive than what I'm describing here. But this is just to show you that this behavioral data per se often doesn't lend itself to get insights on the neural mechanism, but you could complement this protocol with other measures like EEG and get better understanding of the mechanisms. We used a similar kind of take on a different study. Now this was designed also by Kyushi, whereby now you have a U-shaped object, you grasp it several times, you put the sensors under the bars here, you lift it several times, and then you ask the subject, why don't you grasp the other handle? Now the beauty of this task is that as you look at the first trial, this is the torque they're supposed to exert, and this is the target, so this is the torque you exert, sorry, and the line is the desired torque. On the very first trial, subject can use vision to figure out that as you lift the object, there's going to be a torque on this side. There's more mass here. And so even on the first trial, this is again measure and lift off, you almost approach the desired torque. And there's hardly any learning, in fact there is no learning, because you got it so well the first time that pretty much flat. Now the fun part is you're grasping the same object but a different part now. What's going to happen? What was going to happen is that you should be here, because now the torque is opposite, and you exert the torque here. You recover fairly quickly, but then when you go back to the original context, now you're here, not here. And you see again, recover fairly quickly, and you keep going, and you see that there is this gradual improvement in the performance. But this is really striking because the object hasn't changed. You could say this is artificial because we rotate it, or the subject rotates it. Here you could say, but wait a minute, the object is the same. I'm only grasping a different part of the object. What we concluded from this pattern is that subjects are not learning the object properties. They're learning the task. And in a way, they get stuck into this particular behavior. And when you ask them to switch from grasping the same object but now a different torque, they struggle because of the effect of this learning. And this was confirmed by asking the subject to lift the object only once, not 8 times, but once, and switch. This error is much smaller, but still significant. So this now is being followed up by Chris Blaze and Yen. Su Wu also was trained with Mark. And we're doing a similar approach as this, where now we're looking at EEG responses prior and during the lift. This is pre-switch trial. This is the first switch trial. We could see some fairly distinct differences between what happens, between the one learning context and the other. Then we started to move more into the perception-action coupling. This is the work by Daisuke Shibata and Simone Tomo, where we've done some psychophysics, which probably I don't have time now. I'm looking at my watch to go through. But we asked the question, how good are you at sensing the distance between fingers? And in this work, we looked at the contribution of tactile and non-tactile input. We're now looking at gating of sensory inputs, again with Chris and Yen, where we're measuring the responses in the sensory and motor cortex to peripheral neural stimulation. And we're going to put that in the context of different kind of motor task executions. And then this is a work by Simone Toma. It got published last year. And this is work, again, looking not just at sensory, I'm not just looking at muscle synergy as a mean to describe execution of movement, but the way he flipped the story around, and he asked the question whether a synergy-like structure can also account for perception. And so what he did a force perception task where he looked at the dimensionality reduction of muscle patterns, muscle EMG patterns, and asked the question of whether the modulation of the coefficients of the synergies can also account for the sensory performance or psychophysical performance better than a muscle-based model, and it did. So we're now developing this framework to understand a little better the interplay between action and perception. And I think this is the one before the last slide, so if you can bear with me for just a couple of minutes, and then I promise I'll be done. This is a fairly recent kind of work. Is in review right now. Because of Justin Fine and Chris and others, this is a work by Archana, who's a PhD student in the lab. We're looking at this cognitive control question of the ability to inhibit a response. So the classic stop signal task, where you are subject to go after a cue, and in some of those trials, you tell them to stop. And then what we have been experimenting with transcranial focus ultrasound as a mean to focally neuromodulate activity of the cortex, and in this particular case, we focus on the right inferior frontal gyrus. And this is a model of the brain, model of the how the transcranial focus ultrasound target and intensity of the stimulation across 4 subjects. And this is fairly laborious. It's an incredible amount of work, and I'm lucky to have students and postdocs that are working on this. It involved quite a bit of simulation, etc. But we got the setup up and running. And this is the behavioral results of this particular task with and without TFUS. And what you see is that if you present a stop signal, the later you present it, and the more the effect of TFUS is, which implies that you're affecting a stop mechanism, not a go mechanism in this task. And Justin also did this fairly sophisticated modeling using dynamic causal modeling, using EEG, to tease out, basically, to reconstruct the network interactions that would best explain the EEG responses to TFUS and also in baseline conditions. So this is work in progress. If you're interested, you can look it up on bioRxiv. And this is the very last slide. So I mentioned at the very beginning, but then I kind of dropped it, that understanding mechanisms could be useful for potential clinical applications. So this is an example I was lucky to be involved with Antonio Bicchi in Pisa, Jack Hewlandall at Hanger Clinic, and then Karen Andrews and Kristen Zhao at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. The long story short is that Antonio designed and built a prosthetic hand, which is basically based on a synergy design of the data that we collected in 1998. So this is the first principal component. There is one motor that activates 19 joints simultaneously along the first principal component. And we followed up with a number of studies. You could see here, Kyushu was involved in most of these, like this paper, where we tried different kind of designs for myoelectric control. But the ultimate test is going to be the one from patients. I'm just going to show you a few images of a transcranial amputee using the Soft Hand Pro, which is the hand that Antonio Bicchi and his team designed. And this has been tested over and over and over. We're now designing a clinical trial that would allow transcranial amputees to take their hand home and be tested and compared with a commercial prosthesis. And the bottom line is that this synergy design is not only an intriguing way of looking at all this coordination pattern for behavior and neuroscience, but in this particular case, it ended up being a really good application in terms of the clinical translation, because the subject's report is incredibly easy to use, because as you can imagine, the hand molds to any object shape, because there is no motor controlling individual joints. So they find it incredibly easy to learn, incredibly easy to use. And so now the litmus test will be when they take it home and they use it in activities of daily living. And with that, I'm done. And this is the summary. And I hope I convinced you, or at least explain why I really love working with the hand neuromuscular system as a model system. I also try to emphasize the fact that because it's central to activities of daily living, understanding mechanism can have a significant impact on clinical applications. And one of the things that you probably picked is that we use the number of tools, which is almost a necessity in some cases, to really go beyond the behavioral data. As you could see, we use a couple of ways of performing non-invasive neuromodulation, EEG, etc., psychophysics. And this is really, I see this as really different components of the same picture. And this is something that I think is necessary to really understand the inner workings of the hand control. And then, as I mentioned before, the more we understand mechanism, the more likely we might be making an impact on clinical applications. And this is my very last slide with the people that actually did the work or are doing the work right now and current collaborators. And of course, I acknowledge the funding sources. And I'll thank you for your attention.
All right, Marco, thank you very much. And so first, we are going to ask people who were on Zoom to ask questions if they have questions. So anybody?
Hi, Marco. I've got a question. I've got a question. It's I was intrigued by your ultrasound, focal ultrasound stimulation experiment. And are you going to apply the ultrasound throughout? When are you going to turn the ultrasound on and turn it off, basically?
So this was is 500 millisecond stimulation, and we either do it at in this particular paper, we either do it at the presentation of the TFUS, presentation of the go signal, or the presentation of the stop signal. And we realized that delivering TFUS here had no impact on the psychophysical response, but it had significant impact here. What happens is that at the stop signal, as you can see here, what happens is that subjects are much better at inhibiting responses. And so this is very exciting from our perspective, if you want to stop at the behavioral only, because, you wrote a beautiful review article on this, our IFG is known to play a role, but it wasn't clear whether it has top-down effects or not. So the actual role was not possible to delineate, and fMRI is great, but it doesn't have the temporal resolution to really look at these effects in real time. And TMS has limited spatial resolution, which TFUS actually has a very high spatial resolution. So we were able to look at parts of iris stimulating using TFUS, and these are the results that we got. And of course, there's a lot of analysis that Justin ran on this. This is the very last figure of the paper and review, where kind of captures how the different interaction within different nodes enable this particular inhibitional response. And the bottom line of the paper is also that the controversy, as you know, was about whether RFG is mostly involved in attentional reorienting or is actually the driver of response inhibition. And we could rule out the former, even though it does play a role, but it's not, the weight is really on the fact that RFG drives, is directly involved with response inhibition.
Right. I better read the paper, hadn't I? Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, anybody else? Any other questions from this group? Well, if we don't have those questions, that's great, because now Marco can take a look at the chat line.
Okay.
And there are a few questions that wait for your response. I think Daniela Matos had like half a dozen of those, or maybe close to that. So you can take a look at those.
Yeah.
Maybe,
so should I start from the very first?
Well, it's up to you. Yeah, you can do it in any order.
Okay.
Yeah, you can. I try to respond to a couple of those. But it's up to you, of course. Go ahead.
Why don't I start from the bottom and then I'll go the way up, because I see that you already replied to the early ones. So what is model learning for me? That's a big philosophical question. The model learning is a big term in the sense that most people would be careful in defining model learning as separate from model adaptation, meaning that model learning is considered something that the process is underlying learning something from scratch, whereas adaptation is something that you already learned, it's already embedded, and the network has already been kind of fine-tuned to do it, but then you can adapt to different contexts. So in our studies, we're really looking at adaptation model learning per se, because you could argue that you could grasp an object, you could lift it, yeah, you rotated it, but it's not like something you've never done before, you don't know gravity, etc. So in our context, is that I'm not sure if that is if you wanted something deeper than that. That is in the context of our work, broadly speaking. But I'll pause there, Daniel. If you want to follow up, I'll be happy to answer that. And then let's see other questions here. One operator premotor site was chosen. That's a good question. We acknowledge the fact that we have a number of areas involved in planning and execution of grasping, like the network that I showed by Skullcraft and Review. But we wanted to be as conservative and parsimonious as possible, being our first study looking at this. And our model, if you want to be as reductionist as you want and simple, then M1 and S1 are the critical nodes and critical areas that must be involved in ways that we thought they should be involved when we just looked at behavior. We would love to do more areas to look at the interplay between M1 and S1 and association area, etc. But right now, our first shot was really, okay, if we cannot find the grasp context role of M1 and S1 interplay, then there's no point in looking at higher order areas. So that was the rationale. Minor dexterity versus other systems.
Anatol has a question.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? I think it's a question for all auditory. Okay, let's accept the idea that the nervous system remember force required for motor action, and can we explain, given the fact that input-output function of motor neurons mathematically are irreversible, can you explain how physiologically the system can specify the desired force?
Simplistically, you could define it, if you look at development, again, this is hyper simplistic, but you could look at it as a trial error tuning of those parameters, meaning that, as an infant, you fall, you drop things, and, you basically adapt as your body adapts. And ultimately, you set up those, whether it's the threshold of those motor neurons, whether it's the convergence.
The system, sorry, Marco, I should repeat that you cannot, based on knowledge of force, or even EMG generated by motor neuron, you cannot define the threshold position or threshold potential length at which you need to produce in order to generate this force. So it should be understood. To tell the truth, after 50 years of
I wonder
distance of equilibrium point hypothesis, and I still see attempt to explain motor control in terms of mechanics. This is absurdity for me.
I was intrigued by this apparent invariance that if you change from 3 fingers to 2 fingers, I think it was, right? And you didn't have to readapt. And I think that's a little bit what this is about. I wonder if there might be an idea that at this higher level that you're invoking, there is something like a effective sort of more like end effector level model of your actuator that you you represent your hand as like a macroscopic spring, and maybe like with these synergy-based devices where you have one effective overall impedance, and that's how you could generalize. Maybe that would be an answer also to Anatol's question.
You could for some tasks. In the task though where the position is different, the only way you could get the task done is either you change the position so that you keep doing the same thing over and over, or you adapt force. Once you grasp the object, and rarely we change the position after the initial contact, and possibly because we don't have to.
Sorry, can you be more precise?
Yeah.
About which position you are talking about? I'm talking about impossibility to find a threshold position at which you can generate desired force.
So I was talking about, you have a mug, and let me graph it. So I could put, once I grasp the object like this, on the next trial, I might put the finger here. Now, this, if I want to leave the object straight, if the mag, again, there are several conditions that need to be, if I don't care about the object roll, if the mag is empty, and if I don't care about the roll, then of course I could do what, it doesn't matter. But we impose some constraints because we wanted to see what kind of solution emerge once we have those constraints. And so if I want to leave the object straight, and for whatever reason, like, you know, Aaron reported that beautiful paper by Van Beers on the variability of the endpoint, right? So if for whatever reason my finger, I plan to go here, but rather I go here, my only point is that you cannot afford to use the same force you used before, that's all. So at that point, you have two choices. Either I put my finger back if I'm stuck to repeat my actions, you know, as I did before, or if I'm happy to leave the finger here, as I am, then the only way out of this is to change the force. That's all. So the position of the finger, Anatol, is this, where my finger is on the object, and of course the relative position of the finger to each other for this particular task. Now, do we say that you need this modulation of force to position every time? No, because if the text is not dexterous, and I need to be very clear, we're looking at one subset of manual action. We're not looking at power grasp. We're not looking about being sloppy with the orientation of the object. The number, you know, clearly this task doesn't capture all of the other instances. I'm only looking at one task where you need to be precise, you're looking at two fingers, and there is a dexterity element to it. Other cases where the modulation of force to position is not necessary, we can be sloppy, and we are. But when you cannot be sloppy, then I show that people actually adapt to the constraints and do so by changing the force to position. How they do it, I gave you some examples. They might not be exclusive. They could be accounted by other models, which I'm happy to discuss, and also look for the neural correlates. But
my point is that, okay, you can reproduce force, you remember, but you remember not force, but lambda, which brought you a given force, okay? So in order to reproduce your force, you need to remember lambda.
I'm okay with rephrasing the mechanisms, but I don't think it excuses us from the need to search the physiological correlates. And I know you talk about motor neuron excitability, etc.
Yes,
but you know, and you also, last time I asked about the cortical involvement, etc. So I'll be happy to look at the literature more closely. But, and as John Rothman mentioned, I'm fine considering different models, but it has to be grounded in physiology at the end.
My question was very specific. How physiologically you can provide the force you should reproduce, okay? And I know mathematical or computational procedure allows you to find lambda based on force.
Okay.
It's simple mathematical irreversible function of motor neuron of irreversible. And so we need to different framework. Maybe I can help you to think in different framework. Okay. So,
I'm open to think about different frameworks. I'm not defending one framework against the other, but to me the common denominator has got to be physiologically grounded.
No, when incompatible, the two framework programming of forces and specification of lambdas are incompatible.
Okay.
So it's
well, maybe I can. I'm sorry. Maybe I can try to soften a little bit the point that if we assume that we program or that we control movements by specification of reference coordinates, such as lambda for a muscle, we in given conditions to perform a task that's usually formulated in mechanical variables, we learn how to use those reference coordinates to accomplish the task. Like if we want to make a movement, we do not program the movement, but we use lambdas that, based on our previous experience, we know will produce this movement. So the same, I think, can be said about forces, that with some training, that we can learn what kind of lambdas will be, or other reference coordinates at other levels, will be sufficient or will be adequate to produce desired forces. So in a way, I think in Marco's language, he speaks about forces as a very high level of task, not as the biomechanical level of task performance, but as the very high level of task performance. That's what subject sees as a task. And with training, you learn how to do proper lambdas. Just like we can use lambdas to do kinematics.
Mm-hmm.
So we can use lambdas to do kinetics in predictable, reproducible conditions. So my point was that if you change kinematics, if you change conditions, then your lambdas become inadequate. And then you will have torque errors or force errors in the periphery, which I think is something to think about, simply. But I think that it's a little bit of, much of the argument is that the word force in this discussion means two things. One is what you produce in the periphery, and the other is how you conceptualize your task.
Right.
That you think about your task as getting to a certain level of force. And these are different things.
Yes, I agree on that.
All right, are there other questions? And well, Marco, continue looking at, please, continue looking at the chat line. I think you're getting more and more.
Yeah, so the last question, I'm just going randomly through questions, there are quite a few. And I'll be happy, by the way, if this drags on too long, I'll be happy. Feel free to email me if I can go through all the questions. The very last one I see is the role of somatosensory cortex in the consolidation of memory. So I should explain that. It's a great question. In our case, the S1, the way we hypothesized it, was that it would act on an online trial-to-trial basis to modulate force to position. This is where, at least, the effects of CDBS seem to suggest that, and EEG seem to suggest that S1 does convey critical information to M1 to scale the forces to position. So in other words, we're not ruling out that S1 might also be involved in storing a particular representation of a learned task. But in our context, given that what I said before, we're not really looking at an adaptation task per se, because our task is to learn within a couple of lifts. But we're really looking at the S1 trial-to-trial online contribution to that particular force schema. So it's a little different than the force field adaptation task, where just the challenges, I think, it's just much greater and different than in our task. That's at least my interpretation. Let's see to see anything else. I don't know the answer to. It's a great question. Sensory motor retrieval, on where such memories might be stored during and after learning phase, but there is some work looking at the time-dependent involvement in the learning trajectory of M1. And I think it's in rats. I think it came out in Neuron a few years ago. So there's some literature there that would show you that the role of M1 is learning dependent, such that it changes as the task is acquired and learned and stored. When I talk about sensory motor memory, the concept really was originated, at least formalized, by Johansson with the graph studies. And that's what we mostly use to kind of distinguish the two kind of grasps. But there's quite a bit of literature here on the different areas that are involved in the time-dependent fashion as you learn the task. Let's see what else. I see a lot of questions have been answered, so unless I'm missing something that hasn't been answered, I think I'm pretty much done here. Any other question? Or?
Okay, well, Marco, first of all, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For the talk. Second, we have to raise a glass of our favorite drink. In this particular case, I have red wine in honor Italians.
It's too early in Arizona for wine, but consider the toast equally valid. Thank you.
Okay, cheers. Cheers to Marco. Nice. All right, so if we are done for today, so I want to thank everybody who was present, and a reminder that on Tuesday, same time, we get together and we'll listen to Gregor Schoner. So I hope to see all of you and more. Thank you all very much. Then, Marco, you can stop sharing your screen happily.
Sounds good.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, now we can see faces.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care. Thank you very much. And everybody else, thank you very much for joining the company. Goodbye. See you on Tuesday.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye, Mark. Okay, everybody. Thank you again. See you next Tuesday with Gregor Schoner and our last week. Now we are thinking about the second wave of presentations. And we have very nice invited speakers for the second wave. Okay, well, stay safe, have a nice weekend. For the Brazilians, have a nice Mother's Day tomorrow. A big kiss and hugs to all of your mothers. So take care, see you Tuesday. Bye bye.